is Dr. David Hadley, the Visiting Assistant Professor of History at Ashland University. His field of expertise is modern U.S. history with a specific focus on the history of U.S. diplomacy and the history of intelligence and espionage in the Cold War era. Thank you for appearing on our political forum for the Election 20 telecast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. What do you predict the impact of the coronavirus will have on our country during and after the election?
Well, during, I'd say not good.
Right.
I don't really see any way that the current ongoing situation is going to be improved in the short term. Long term, it's a lot more difficult to predict, and as a historian looking back at my batting average of predictions, I do pretty poorly with it.
Okay.
So I don't want to go on it too much. What I'm hoping is that it will kind of reinforce the need for a much more concerted, public health preparedness program, because while, this one has been the most dramatic, there have been a kind of series of potential outbreaks that we've had before this one of, diseases that might have been this one.
Right.
So hopefully we'll be able to take from this a set of lessons learned and kind of move from there to develop an infrastructure that's able to deal with things like this without the kind of disruption to our everyday lives that we've been experiencing.
Definitely. What qualities do you believe our country needs in a president at this time?
So in general, I'd say kind of steadiness and pragmatism are always what you'd want to see in kind of a political leader in a democratic system, and especially at this time being clear and consistent with communication. That, if you talk to public health experts, if you look at kind of past incidences of not just pandemics, but crisis in general, one of the things that's very important is to have a clear and consistent communication, not just from the president, but that comes from the entire administration and the entire government.
For sure. What differences do you see happening in America's current foreign policies if Biden is elected president?
So I think the main difference would be an effort to engage more closely with some of our traditional partners in the NATO alliance and in Southeast Asia. We haven't drifted away from those entirely. There's some daylight between what President Trump has said are his thoughts and feelings on these relationships and what current official U.S. policy is. I think that daylight would close a lot more under President Biden than what it currently would.
Okay.
I tend to think that Biden administration would be inclined to be less confrontational with Iran than President Trump currently is. But the other big trick about foreign policy is a lot of presidents who did not think that they were going to be defined by foreign policy or get to chart their own way in foreign policy are surprised by events. Some presidents that we most associate with foreign policy had no idea that that was going to come to dominate their administration. So while I think Biden temperamentally, based on his statements, wants to try and kind of return to an era of more multilateralism, that might also just be, events have a way of intervening.
For sure. How has the COVID-19 virus and President Trump's response to the virus affected U.S. diplomacy with other nations?
Well, I think like everything, it strained it. I think probably that some kind of strain would be inevitable when you're dealing with the effort to, manage borders during a crisis like this. The decision to ban travelers from Europe early on, and now the kind of the European efforts to restrict U.S. travel, I think that's generating some degree of tension. This summer there was a proposal from several European nations to kind of develop a joint vaccine activity, joint research that the United States didn't take part in, which I think that might have some kind of lingering resentments coming on. Most of all, the U.S. decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. It's an imperfect organization. Clearly it had missed a few steps early on, to put it mildly, early on. But the decision to withdraw from it, whether you think that decision was a good one or not, which I can see both sides on that, it will have further ramifications for our relationships internationally.
Definitely. How has the borders being closed and countries quarantined in the last 6 months impacted international relationships between the U.S. and other countries?
Well, That I think we're really going to have to see in maybe a year from now or the long term from now, was what this kind of restriction on travel has done for us. Because it's possible that this is going to be a brief hiccup, and all of the changes that we've kind of seen of being more localized, not traveling as much, that will just be kind of a memory. But it might also, on the other hand, encourage greater local focus, kind of interrupt the trend we've seen in terms of easier travel and more frequent travel among people in the world.
For sure. Has President Trump's COVID-19 response protected the U.S. or damaged it in regards to international relations?
I think that it's potentially not an easy answer to come to, because it really depends again on how all of the fallout is going to come. Basically, the relationships have been strained, as I was saying, with some of the decisions, such as around the WHO.
Right.
That kind of strain, a lot of multilateral relationships that we have, we've had strain before and have been able to kind of come back from that. The skepticism towards diplomacy, towards kind of multilateral negotiation, multiple countries kind of coming together that the Trump administration has. This reflects, I think, a pretty long-standing idea of America having a kind of special place that Trump is not the first president to express. Some of that has already, up to COVID, caused tensions, and then COVID accelerates those things. It's accelerated a lot of trends that were already there.
Yes, for sure. President Trump is spending less on TV ads and holding more live campaign rallies in Ohio than Vice President Biden. What are the motivations behind these two different campaign angles, would you say?
So if I had to take a guess, it's that Biden wants to win Ohio, of course. I mean, I'm sure he'd love to win everywhere,
right.
And President Trump as well. But Biden has a path to victory that doesn't involve Ohio. He's not knocked out in the Ohio polls that we've seen, but he has a stronger polling position in some other major states that will give him a path to the White House without Ohio. So it's kind of, if Biden wins Ohio, then it's likely he's already won the presidency. Whereas, and the reverse is true as well, that if President Trump has lost Ohio, then it's not impossible, but it's harder to see a viable path for him going forward than that. He has to essentially hold on to the states that he held on to the states that he won in 2016 with maybe one loss.
Okay. What key factors should the public be paying attention to in this presidential race?
So there's kind of two things that are at the top of my mind with this. The first is the importance of keeping up with what are the restrictions and regulations around different forms of voting, mail-in balloting, early balloting, that it's really important for people who want to have their voices heard to pay close attention to all of those details, to think ahead of time about how they're going to vote and to develop a plan for voting. Our Secretary of State here in Ohio has committed that, absentee voting is going to be possible, safe, and effective, that you won't have your ballots just discounted and there won't be ballots showing up out of nowhere. So that's something that I hope people are paying attention to early. And the other kind of speaks to my particular areas of concern with intelligence, which is there is, at least according to the sources that we've seen testifying in Congress recently, an active and ongoing effort to disrupt the U.S. campaign from foreign actors, most notably, but probably not only Russia. And this really speaks to the desire to kind of further divide. But the other thing to keep in mind with this is we don't want to give that too much power, is those things can only find purchase if we're willing to share an article that makes us angry without stopping to find out where it comes from.
Yes.
If we're reacting emotionally without kind of logically examining the news that we get.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hadley, for joining me tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Now let's go back to the Election 20 update set with Jordan and Lewis.